In this video, we're going to look at human rights advocacy in an emergency. When civilians are being tortured and killed, and casualties are mounting, what can you do to stop it? In December 2012, a conflict broke out in the relatively unknown country of Central African Republic. Rebels called the Seleka began a campaign of violence targeting the Muslim population. Philippe Bolopion, the UN Director for Human Rights Watch, went to document the conflict, and then he helped to convince the UN Security Council to deploy a peacekeeping operation to help stop the carnage. This is the story.
Well, the civilian suffering was the most shocking aspect, because as these rebels took over the country, they essentially chased down people out of their villages. They burned entire villages. They were looting, killing, raping. So you would go through entire parts of the country where you'd be on a road and you'd go through village after village that were completely deserted. And all of that was because of a few hundred armed guys that were completely out of control. So you would have hundreds of thousands of people displaced only by the fear of a few poorly armed rebels. What really struck me once I was there on the ground is to realize that the Seleka were not much of a military threat. They were, just because they had a couple of pickup trucks and a few rusty weapons, they were able to wreak havoc on the whole country and scare people everywhere. But the truth is that any modest military force could have easily confronted them. So after being on the ground, we became convinced that it was actually a good mission for a UN peacekeeping force. We know that UN peacekeepers are not great at waging war in very hostile environments, but they can help secure areas and reassure the civilian population when the only threat is from a few spoilers that can be kept in check fairly easily. So when I came back, from my first trip, that was the main recommendation that we started working on, is how can we get UN peacekeepers there? Only a couple of thousands of peacekeepers could make a huge difference in this country and allow people to go back to their villages, go back to their land and restart their lives. So for UN peacekeepers, blue helmets, to be deployed on the ground, you need a decision from the UN Security Council, which is 15 countries, 5 of them who are permanent members and have a veto power: the US, France, the UK, Russia, and China. So you need these 5 to be on board and the rest of the council to be on board to deploy a peacekeeping mission. It's an expensive proposition. A peacekeeping mission of the type we thought was needed in the Central African Republic can quickly run at $1 billion a year. And the US and Western countries happen to foot most of that bill. In fact, the US pays almost a quarter of that bill. So the US was clearly a very important target. I would say the issue that we faced was that there was simply a lack of interest for the Central African Republic. It's not a very strategic country. It doesn't have huge amounts of natural resources. When you have an issue like that, you have to take it with different angles. First, you need to secure at least one or a few countries that are your allies in the Security Council, that are the countries who are going to take on your recommendations, or maybe they have come to the same conclusion on their own, and run with it in the Security Council. Nothing will happen in the Council just because Human Rights Watch or NGOs want something. It's a state institution. You need a state to take it on. So we had to work on the French, who were feeling most responsible for the situation because of their colonial past, because they were what we call the pen holders in the Security Council. They were the one drafting the resolutions on the Central African Republic. So getting the French on board was key. Then you have to get the US on board. And at the time when we were pushing for that peacekeeping mission, the US was going through a huge financial crisis. There was a government shutdown in Washington. And so the idea that Congress, would be asked to authorize, hundreds of millions of dollars for a mission in a country that no one had ever heard of in the US was also a tough sell. So how do you get a country on board? It's difficult, right? Especially when an issue is not in the news, and the Central African Republic was not in the news at all because the world is in chaos. There were 10 other crises going on at the same time, and people were simply not paying attention because there was very little coverage. So we had to first try to get more press coverage. We did that by writing op-eds, by taking on mission with us a brilliant photographer and videographer who was providing a lot of images that helped, shape the narrative about the situation. We were talking to journalists. We had a lot of face-to-face meetings with government officials. So on my way back from the Central African Republic, I stopped in Paris and I had high-level meetings at the Quai d'Orsay, the French Foreign Affairs Ministry, and in the French Defense Ministry to talk to people who are following the Central African Republic and essentially ring the alarm bell. The next step was to go to the Security Council and tell the council members, you need to deploy a UN peacekeeping mission. And to do that and have some credibility, it shouldn't be just us, Human Rights Watch, or other NGOs saying that. The UN system itself, the UN Secretariat, needs to be behind the idea. So at the time when I was in the Central African Republic, the second time around, there was a mission from the UN Secretariat that had been deployed to make recommendations to the Security Council on what a peacekeeping mission could look like and give them, different options, a very light option to a more serious peacekeeping mission. So we engaged a lot with that mission and we had the contacts. We knew these people, some of them, we've known them for years, and we talked to them about our ideas. We tried to convince them that a significant peacekeeping mission could make a difference there. And they took that idea on board. They made recommendations to the Security Council that included the kind of comprehensive UN peacekeeping mission that we thought was needed for the situation. The first time I came back from the Central African Republic, maybe 2 or 3 days after I was back, I had a meeting with almost all the Security Council members at pretty senior level to describe the situation on the ground. So, for me to be able to be around the table with 15, diplomats from the council and be able to answer all of their questions and defend our ideas about the peacekeeping mission was, I think, a turning point for me in the advocacy at the UN. It's at that time I felt that now we had a constituency of diplomats who were interested about the situation, knew how it felt to be there, because when I briefed them, I really tried to not just give them a very dry political analysis of the situation, but tell them the stories that we had encountered and the things that you could tell were getting them, interested in the situation. And so from that point on, I felt that, we had enough of attention on the issue that we would be able to move it forward. I would say the US was a tough nut to crack. They had concerns about the costs that were, almost overriding everything else. So maybe a week or two after I came back from my first trip in the Central African Republic, I went to Washington with the idea to really work on that. So I testified in front of the House Subcommittee on Africa. Explain what the situation was like. I then went to the White House and talked to, maybe there were almost 10 people in the room, including some people from the Atrocities Prevention Board, who were, again, starved for information. They had no antennas on the ground, no clue what the situation was like, and to come fresh from the ground and be able to tell them what we had seen and what we had experienced was I think, a powerful tool. And I also went to the State Department where the same thing happened. There were maybe 10 people in the room for the briefing, and people had seen a few things on the news, but they had so many questions for us. And the fact that we were able to answer the factual questions was also giving us much more credibility when the time came to make recommendations. The financial aspect is very hard for us to address, right? Because the US was having a real budget crisis. And so the case that I was trying to make time and time again is, look, the longer you wait, the more it's going to cost. Because if you go in now before people start, killing each other on a large scale, you can still, with a modest peacekeeping mission, you can still control the situation. At the end of the day, that argument had some weight. They realized that the situation was clearly sliding out of control, and that it was better to intervene early on their own accord than being dragged in, a year down the line, facing a situation that would be unmanageable. So that was a strong argument. Once we had, the French on board, the US on board, a few of the friendly countries on the Council on board, when the UN system was also, making recommendations that were going in the same direction, we had built enough media attention. We had a large coalition of NGOs at that point that was supporting the plan. And that's when, the momentum was there, and the momentum was finally on our side. We went from preaching in the desert to actually being a powerful presence at the UN. A few well-equipped, well-trained, professional UN peacekeepers would go a long way. To me, this was, clearly a situation where the odds were against us. When you're trying to attract attention to an issue that nobody cares about, it's not good to be alone in doing that. So part of the plan from day one was to try to rally, other NGOs behind our proposals. So, one of the first things I did when I came back from the Central African Republic is to call my friends from other NGOs, Amnesty International and others, and share, my experiences and start, brainstorming with them about what was the best solution to this situation and how to push it jointly. Very quickly, we were able to send joint letters to the Security Council with, international NGOs, African NGOs, Crisis Action, which is an NGO that helps other NGOs do joint advocacy, was also, helping us get meetings at the UN, push, op-eds. In this country that had no institutions left, no police, no army, no justice, no, mayors, nothing. Everything was gone. The only functioning institutions were the religious ones. And you had the Muslim population that was led by an imam that I met when I was in the Central African Republic, who was a very peaceful man, very courageous. He had been himself in trouble with the Seleka Muslim leaders because they thought he was not, on their side enough. And the Christian community was also led by two religious leaders who were responsible, and the three of them were really working hand in hand to try to calm the situation down. They would even travel together around the country to talk to people and try to calm down the religious tensions. So I talked to Crisis Action about trying to help these three religious leaders and try to get them to amplify their message. So Crisis Action, made contact with them. They paid for them to go on a trip to Europe, to the US. They even came and testified to the Security Council, and they were presenting a really powerful voice. It was not, a Western NGO, coming lecturing the Security Council about what to do. It was the religious leaders from a broken country that were pleading for help and support. And so to get them also behind our recommendation was really a key moment. Eventually, the Security Council authorized the deployment of a UN peacekeeping mission. Even before the UN deployed on the ground, the fact that the Security Council authorized the mission sent a powerful message to the armed groups in the country. They knew that the international community cared about the situation. They knew that peacekeepers were coming, and that really changed the dynamics. Then it took several months. A lot of, the UN struggled to find troops to deploy in the Central African Republic. It's not the kind of place where people are fighting to go. So they had to what's called rehat soldiers from the African Union mission, get them up to speed and up to UN standards. And so it took some time, but I would say that it was a game changer to have, several thousands of UN peacekeepers, eventually close to 10,000, being deployed in that country that had nothing. Really made a huge difference.